So, if you haven't come to any of our events before, this is Libreum Research Institute. Want to give you a little bit of background on what we're trying to achieve here and why we want to do podcasts. This is a live video podcast, which nobody does. But I thought it was important because, one, you can kind of get an experience of how we kind of think through problem solving using different applications of agent-based modeling, machine learning techniques, other types of advanced technologies. But I think it's important to understand that the ecosystem around agent-based modeling is just getting started. There are great groups like NESI, the New England Complexity Institute, or Santa Fe Institute. There's programs all around the world that are slowly popping up. Santa Fe having been doing a lot of this type of research for decades now, maybe even half a century. It's been a long time since they started. But it's getting to the point where I think in the next 5 years, agent-based modeling is going to be more practical. So, and we'll talk about what are the issues, how do we create a community around it, how do we get you guys involved with projects and research opportunities, and connecting the dots with industry if you're a student or post-grad, or you're trying to just get a new perspective. So we've had people in economics, we've had entrepreneurs, CEOs in international finance, we've had people in politics and military on a global perspective to kind of share their thoughts around the ecosystem, around data, and understanding and modeling the behavior of humans. That really is what Libreum Research Institute is about, how to connect all those dots, those different people, those ideas and new things that are coming up, and how we can create an ecosystem around that. We've done some engagements and projects that are really cool. So we think, at least, like I said, over the next 5 years, maybe even 4 years now, the practicality with the technology curve is becoming more and more apparent. So we think we're going to be pioneers on creating that ecosystem with Libreum Research Institute. If you're wondering what the heck is Libreum, Libreum is not the antipsychotic drug that my mother-in-law informed me since she was a nurse in a psychiatric ward before. Libreum is based on the word equilibrium, and it's creating a balance of how you think about research and also making it pragmatic. And that's kind of how I think about it in this context. Speaking of context, want to give everybody some background on who we are now. A lot of you who've been coming to these conversations for the past year or so have a little bit of idea of my background, a little bit of Sandeep's background, but I want to kind of rehash a little bit about who we are and where we've come from and all the headaches in the process. So, Sandeep, walk us through, where you came from originally, and I know that one of the things that you always talk to me about is like some of the original, non-sentient AI, or basically programmatic AI that you were building in stock market trading. So kind of lead us, your background up to that point, and I got some other questions.
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town back in India, and my engineering was at IIT Kharagpur. So there I got to do a bunch of things. I was doing mechanical engineering. I was also doing biomedical engineering, so sort of a combination of that. And that got me introduced to the idea of agent-based modeling. Not the term itself, but fundamentally, biology is where you look at single cells, small things and stuff like that, and see how it all comes together. And because I was doing mechanical engineering, where a lot of the focus was top-down, it was a really good way of starting to think about what is the amalgamation of these two things, right? So that's what sort of sparked my curiosity in terms of, I didn't even know the term agent-based modeling at that point, but fundamentally, there's a difference between a top-down way of thinking and a bottom-up way of thinking. And pros and cons for both of them, right? There are certain times when one is relevant, the other is relevant at the other points in time. So where I was able to quickly incorporate at that point was, I remember it was maybe third year into IIT where we first got our computers, believe it or not, like the first time computers individual every room. And the only place there was data available was stock market. So, I went through the overall, hey, look at trends, try and break it down and do a whole host of stuff. Or you could look at sort of individual ticks and stocks and stuff like that and see what the market would behave. And the second was more interesting to me, one, because there wasn't a lot of money I had to trade with. So the returns weren't the thing I was looking for, but fundamentally the excitement of, say, can I do something which can help explain what I'm seeing in the market? So it was mainly from an exploratory standpoint that I started developing a lot of these models now. that was used to sort of simulate or for me to understand how the stock market works, right? So I did that. My thesis actually was, it was a biology and mechanical engineering combination where I had to look at patterns from the ECG and see if I could predict something would happen 3, 6, 10 minutes down the road, right? So then again, you had to look at individual 12 signals of the ECG, combine it together. As opposed to top-down, you had to look at it more bottom-up. So I think it was a combination of a lot of these. At that point, I hadn't quite formalized what ABM was at that point. It still wasn't the most practical thing to do. It was always done sort of in specific corners of the world, that sort of stuff. But that's where it all started for me. And when I came to Georgia Tech here, biomedical engineering again. So
before you go to Georgia Tech, so I know that you helped build a robotics community. So tell us about like what that was and why'd you start it and how it had grown dramatically.
A part of it was fun. I think that's what we wanted to do. But this was again right around the time at IIT Kharagpur we created, I and a bunch of people, we created the first robotics competition at IIT Kharagpur. It was part of our technology festival, and it was still an up and coming thing. And all we wanted to do was we wanted to bring in the best in terms of robotic technology, the software and the hardware both at that point to do something cool and interesting. So in fact, the first problem we had was very simple. On a track, we had to get the robot to actually move around the track and come back. And it wasn't a circle, but it wasn't that complicated, right? And this is instructive because when we first started thinking about the problem itself, right, it was, hey, all right, we're going to put a camera on this, and we're going to look at the environment, and I can detect the objects, and then I can sort of move perfectly because I can detect the road. It's different from the obstacles, and I can sort of do that, right? And we tried, and it was just hard. We just couldn't do it. And this was a few days before. I remember one of the teams, and I was talking to them, and they said they had figured out something dumb and simple. And all they had done was they had put 2 sensors on the side of the robot, and if it bumped on the right sensor, it turned left, and it bumped on the left sensor, it turned right. So it would just bump its way all the way to the end. And that was just a cool way of thinking, hey, such a complex system, I could do complicated machine learning and computer vision stuff. Well, it's just based on bumps, how something simple would do. And it did a pretty complicated loop. And that was the aha. You don't have to go complicated. Yeah. And then now you imagine like, hey, you put a lot of these cars together, and suddenly the machine learning part becomes so complicated. But if you think simple, that problem is a lot more eminently solvable. So that was, again, another validation of thinking simple doesn't mean it's the simplicity of it. It's not the simple part of it. It's when you think simple, a lot of complex things can be done. And that was a big aha coming out of the robotics.
And this is way before Tesla. Oh. I mean, this is like, over a decade before Tesla was even created.
This was early 2000s.
And that's where it's interesting where, like, you talked about coming into Georgia Tech for bioengineering or biomedical engineering. The technology, it feels like it's yesterday, but it's also a very, especially in an exponential curve, the amount of computational power we take for granted. Every year we take for granted what we have. But when you're running these, I guess, nascent neural networks, I mean, what kind of computational power are you able to even put together in context to today?
Yeah, I think it's... Back then, there was hardly anything, right? I think we were trying to put a chip on car at that point to make it work. It just wouldn't work at that point, right? I think nowadays, I think a lot of that can be done on chips, right? So what needed massive computers can go on really small chips and be a lot more effective, right? And when you think about agent-based models, it gets a lot more complicated because now you have a lot of these agents, hundreds, thousands, millions. That's where it needs to get to practical.
We'll get to agent-based modeling in a second. We're jumping ahead. So... biomedical engineering, bioengineering, graduate school at Georgia Tech. What brought you there as opposed to anywhere else? And then, the biomedical engineering program had just started at Tech, I think a couple of years before you came, and it's been ranked top 3 basically in the world, top 5, whatever. So one, can you kind of walk us through that? And then bioengineering and its perspective and how its approach is slightly different for modeling purposes as opposed to a physics approach. And we'll talk about ABM in a minute, but just walk us through that first from an educational standpoint.
Yeah, the answer to the first question of why I showed up at Georgia Tech was very simple. I think the way it worked was I looked at usnews.com, it ranked the top 10, I applied to the top 5, and Georgia Tech gave me a scholarship. So that was as simple as that, right? So, but coming into Georgia Tech, it was a very different perspective, bioengineering, the way it was done here, just because it was ages ahead of what I had done, what I had learned back in India as well. And so that's a good segue into your question about physics versus biology. I think there's a fundamental difference. I mean, of course, physics is different than biology, but how to think about it, right? There's one is more theoretical, equation based, that you're trying to figure out and how the world works. Biology is fundamentally the small things and how they interact to create something big, right? And one of them is not necessarily right or wrong. I think there have been benefits of both, but I think what this program taught me was the intersection of these two places where the magic happened. And hence, it wasn't so much, I know we'll get into ABM, it wasn't so much to understand agent-based modeling, but it was just to understand the foundational truth for anything, whether it's how we do what we do or whatever that may be. You have to go at it both ways. And just going top down, which is where most of my early education was, just gives you half the picture.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll kind of bridge that with kind of my background a little bit. So I even to this day, and many of you who love technology and science fiction, there was 3 book series that made a big difference, and I still can say it applies to kind of how we build companies and apply these technologies. One is Isaac Asimov. Isaac Asimov is really interesting because for a person who's written so many prolific novels, the Foundation series, the Robot series, he's actually written so many college level and graduate level books, books that they use in the classroom. So I think what was interesting about Isaac Asimov, as opposed to some of the other authors, is I think he was the international vice president of Mensa. The guy is a genius. But at the same time, I think the genius that he was able to share in the Foundation series is the same that Carl Sagan and Feynman would say, which is that if you can't explain it in a simple way to a kid, you really don't know what you're talking about. Because there's a lot of scientists that I work with constantly that make things complicated and can't explain it simply in a way that anybody else can understand. So there is a duality to it, which is that, if you've watched, me growing up, I watched Cosmos by Carl Sagan, and trying to understand the fundamental building blocks from their perspective at that time. And with the realization, there's a great book by Bill Bryson called A Short History of Nearly Everything, which at the end of the day, anything that fast forward 10 years, it's probably going to either be proven wrong or the framework in which to look at it changes. I'm not saying that the rules of physics or the rules of statistics are wrong, but things like a bottom-up approach by, especially from a computational standpoint, being able to understand how an organism works, but getting semi-real-time data allows you to build a model in the interaction level. So some of the ideas may have been around for decades, but they haven't been really practical until recently, and we're going to go into that. So from the Foundation series, what I always looked at was understanding that human behavior at the micro level can create an emergence understanding at the macro level. So ultra large population over long periods of time, how these interactions can happen to create possibilities. Now, the problem with the fundamental thesis, they created this idea called psychohistory, which I think really mimicked agent-based modeling. So if you ever get the chance, go ahead and read in the Foundation series. You'll get a framework of understanding how the behavior of an individual at large scale and its interaction with the individuals interacting with each other create certain types of outcomes. Now, on one side, somebody can say, oh, this is predicting the future. Like I know the future. But more practically, what it can do is help you avoid problems and avoid where the system starts to break down. It can't necessarily tell you what the future is going to be, but what these interactions can do is give you a framework of understanding information. And I always push back on people who say whether, especially with the statistical models, like I always say with statistical models, it's always correct till it's not, and then it catastrophically blows up, which is usually what ends up happening, which is why, people like Nassim Taleb become very famous for these ideas like the black swan, where there's no probability of these events happening. But then if you look at some of the models, they have these fat tails, where from a distribution model, that if you go out so many standard deviations out, events actually start to happen at a higher frequency, which is really odd from the way we normally perceive. But the biggest problem is we're looking at it top down. For example, I love lottery winners, because if you look at it on a pure statistical basis, it should never happen. But 100% of the time, somebody wins the lottery. Now, have they beaten the odds? Is it that it was actually played billions and trillions of times, and that's how somebody won some, there was like some $700 million or $500 million win in the lottery, I think a few years ago or something like that? Or is there something different? And that's where it's really interesting to kind of understand the science. I'm not going to go into gambling, and I'm not going to go into lottery and how to play the lottery. But there are these ideas that have existed for now over a half a century. And so I think Asimov was definitely a big influencer. The other one was Ender's Game, the whole Ender series. The reason why I love that series, for those of you who are trying to get into machine learning, is there was a character called Jane, which was actually created from an artificial intelligence system to manage both a psychological understanding of the main character and also managing money and finance. And when you're reading it, growing up, these are things like, wait a minute, there's an artificial intelligence system that can take in huge amounts of data, also understand human behavioral understanding, but at a massive scale, where it's not actually a single quote-unquote idea or being, but it's a distributed computing architecture over time and space. That was pretty cool as an idea. I definitely would recommend that you guys read the Ender series. The other one was Dune. Yes, Dune doesn't really talk so much. I think some of the later books talk about robotics and artificial intelligence, but it's more the applications of technology within society. How does religion, how does military, how does these types of social constructs factor in modeling behavior over a large scale, and how those interactions can be simulated? And that's what we'll jump into. So I know that sounds like not my background at all, but those are big influences, because I think that, you look at, I think these geniuses of the past, they're geniuses going forward because they have an understanding of the fundamentals of how humanity works and how to extrapolate that from a modeling standpoint to make it practical. So I had the fortune of growing up where, my dad was working at Westinghouse in an astrophysics nuclear program based in Pittsburgh, managing the facilities over there. So they had a partnership with Carnegie Mellon University, which had one of the earliest supercomputing labs for finite element analysis to simulate the behavior of water over a nuclear submarine, basically for managing sound to be optimized. Just being able to even understand that concept of how do you simulate? Can you imagine the simulations of basically thermodynamics and water, like in the 60s and 70s? It's always incomprehensible based upon the technology that you have at that point in time, which is why it's so exciting to see how much they were able to accomplish then with little, which goes back to this idea that you were talking about, how it doesn't have to be a complex solution to the problem. In fact, that whole concept of Occam's razor, you're finding the simplest solution but no simpler, is a very difficult task. And that's where I think that getting exposure to large-scale supercomputing architecture, understanding its practical nature where it actually goes to market, in that case, a nuclear submarine, really gets me to think, okay, what can you do to simplify models? Now, let's kind of jump into agent-based modeling. So you talked about stock market. In fact, that was kind of the first database background. So I was using DBase at the time to build a model on the stock market. So everybody's probably going crazy. It's kind of, seeing the stock market. I wasn't in, was it GameStop? I wasn't in GameStop. I'm not a day trader anymore. Those are decades ago. But let's walk through maybe from a stock standpoint, because a lot of the audience has maybe a stock or has done some trading and has some context there. So agent-based modeling. Walk us through, okay, so GameStop. All these people, individuals, at very small increments, and some big hedge funds, were trading the stock. Yeah. So what can ABM do to understand the behavior of these individuals and their interactions with the stock, the media, Reddit, all these other factors?
Yeah, and this is a classic example, because usually when I talk about stock markets, right, the first question I get is, let's take traditionally the way agent-based model is defined, right, where you have an agent, it interacts with an environment, and based on that, some things happen, right? the first question that comes is, well, what environment are we talking about? Where is the interaction? I invest in a stock, it goes up, down, flat. What's the interaction all about, right? If anything, this example shows, because of how this all happened, think about where it started, right, from a media, right, Reddit, for example, right, what their individual motivations were, right, and then for them to have come together to figure out a certain behavior that they want to induce within the stock market takes an amazing amount of coordination, yet it's not that much because there wasn't a single mastermind trying to do everything. This is a bunch of people coming together to make something as massive as this happen. Now again, the scale of this is pretty massive. This is an extremely liquid, well-developed stock market where these anomalies shouldn't happen. Like, where is the rational behavior here? Where is the equilibrium theory and a whole host of that? This is a bunch of people finding a way to coordinate to achieve a common goal with very simple ways. And these aren't necessarily professional traders. These are people sitting on the side, have some money, throwing it in for whatever purpose, right? So it brings together sort of some of the ideas in agent-based modeling. One is it's a collection of individuals, right? That's number one. And they coordinate together in some way, shape, or form, right? So it's a bunch of people, and not millions or trillions, billions. So you're talking about maybe, I don't know, thousands of people trying to do this. Simple rules, because they couldn't have a mastermind coordinating every single move. Very simple rules, creating a buzz, using media as an environment, seeing what happens in the stock market, using that as feedback to create a behavior, to go against hedge funds or whatever that may be in this case. So this, again, puts forth sort of a lot of the elements that we typically don't do when we think about basic stock market trading.
Yeah.
And if this idea you take to a lot of the approach of trading stocks, well, you can do something with it.
So like the traditionalists would say, well, it was just a blip and it happened in a short period of time and it went back,
Sure.
After the stock already rose all the way back up, it went all the way back down, and everybody got back to their senses. And so a lot of traditional statistical modelers about the market would say it doesn't make a difference at all.
Sure.
So, and even with COVID, shutdown in the marketplace, and then even like the last crash is like, oh, well, if you would have just bought and held, given enough time, you're going to be fine. So why can't I just take that approach, quote unquote, diversify my assets, put it in investments, and then magically all my things will be perfectly fine no matter what the market does?
Yeah, I'm reminded of, this was 10 years back, I was talking to a trader who used to do some options trading, and one of the things he said when I was talking about this long-term, short-term, he's like, there's only one certainty. Long-term, we're actually all dead, right? So nothing really matters from that perspective, right? So, but think about, even if it's this blip, well, it's a blip considering everything. Now, but this has given a model to a bunch of people on how to do something.
Yeah.
And massive fortunes were probably made and lost. So
Yeah.
to the people who are in there, it made all the difference. For the rest of us, it's a blip. But let's just say it's not significant. I think it's a significant blip. It's as much as a blip. In the grand scheme of things, there was a 1987, the Black Monday, which was a blip. It was just one day, but that made a big difference to how we think about things, right? And what we haven't even spoken about is what's the potential of these blips to create a domino effect. And that's the other thing that happens, right? Right now it is, but what's to say that there aren't kids looking at this and saying, what can we actually do to make this more common and work in our favor, right? And that's where this comes in. So this is just the beginning of things. Now, can this be done in a conscious way over time? I think so. And if it can be, that's going to change fundamentally how things work.
So do you think that, okay, so again, trying to understand the construct of ABM. So one thing that statistics does is looks at everything in retrospect, right? Is there anything that ABM can do on a prospective basis? So is there any way in the future, so we've got this GameStop, there's a whole bunch of other stocks. There was like AMC, a whole bunch of other stocks that were going through massive volatility, huge up, huge down. Is there anything that we can do from a modeling standpoint to learn from that or learn from different behaviors to model that predictively in the future, if that's going to happen?
And the way I think about this is when I think about future, there is prediction, but there's also creation, right? So maybe the answer is not prediction, but can you use this? And I would argue there is something here where you could look at this approach of how many people got together on what stock, which means you truly understand what kind of interest there is, what kind of daily average volume trade there is, how many people are short the stock, I think there's a bunch of factors that need to happen. If you can identify that, I would argue there's a model out there that people can actually create this reality and hence predict it, right? So it's just a way of thinking about for prediction versus creating. And that's the thing, as you were talking about Carl Sagan and some of the folks there, people often wonder, wow, there are some of these geniuses who predicted, there'll be these computers in our pockets like 20, 30 years from now. And which is true, but I also think these geniuses also set the tone for other people to dream and create that, right? So there's prediction, but there's also creation. Sometimes the boundaries get blurred between those two. And so I would use this as a model for creation, and for some people it'll be prediction.
So are you saying then that if I'm a future stock trader, I can't really use this to model the behavior of a market so I can try to, I guess, invest and make money?
You can, absolutely. I mean, after 2008, I think there was, some of the interest in ABM was really, really strong at that point, because the way entire thing was built with credit default swap was a top-down model. There were these Gaussian curve-based approaches which looked at the risk and said, there isn't a lot of risk if you were to do something like that. But when that happened, I think the interest in ABM took off. So fundamentally now, a lot of people are, and it's hard, right? I can't say that there's anybody who's successfully done it 100%, but a lot of people are looking at individual pieces of the market and saying, hey, what is an ABM way of doing this thing?
So the way I've kind of looked at it is, you might actually have like a convergence approach to a degree. So if you have a statistical model that's telling you the behavior of the market is going to be this way, and an agent-based simulation that tells you the market can be like this, because you've got a lot of this underlying data and modeling what the behavior of the population could be within a market. Is there, in the stock market trading, you've got your beta line, and then you've got this convergence of it. So beta being whatever the market is that you're playing, or equity or whatever. And then you've got your traditional statistical model where a lot of the institutions are running these their models, and they're pretty well-known models that the market's going to use, or even companies like Morningstar, when they rate, like, they're fairly standardized, fairly transparent in what they're looking at. Is there a way that you can kind of arbitrage the way that the traditional large institutions are looking at it, and kind of how, if you've got similar data but you're modeling the individual behavior? So walk me through, how would I think through that?
So I'll give you an example. There's something actually we used to do 6-8 years ago when we were looking into options trading and stuff like that. And here's where, so for example, if you look at, on an average, the curve of how an option decays is fairly well established. But when you start looking at it very specifically, maybe an hour before expiration, 2 hours before expiration, you understand the psychology of what's going on. It breaks apart from the model. And there's plenty of money to be made while that edge lasted, right? And so a lot of these folks, and when we say efficient market theory, it's not fundamentally efficient. I think what people do is try to look at what the average is trying to say, whereas try to look at there's a better winch or a model out there and capture the differences. And that's how in some ways markets do get efficient, but there's a lot of irrationality that has to be consumed for the market to be rational, right? I think that's the way I think about it.
So that's how I've always looked at it, which is like a statistical model is always looking backwards, and it's always going to be correct as long as you look backwards, because it never is trying to model the behavior of an environment, although a lot of people use it to model what the future is going to be. And that's where I find is the big potential disaster, right? And it constantly happens. On the flip side, you've got another approach, which is saying, okay, I may not know what's going to happen in the future, but I'm going to model the behavior of a certain agent or a stock or behavior in the marketplace, and see how that would create a certain outcome in the stock price or option price or whatever I'm trading, to see what that's going to be relative to the entire marketplace. Is that kind of the way to look at it?
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it fundamentally. Yeah, I think with statistics, apart from the fact that it's history, apart from the fact it's basically an average across time, and that's where for me it breaks apart, because what you can do at every moment matters, and it can be very different because the market changes every moment. So when I say on an average what's been the return in the stock market, that's an average across years, decades, if not more, right? But there's plenty to be done within. Day traders do it just within a day. There are high frequency computers who are trading within seconds, for example, right? So in some ways, I think of these are two important concepts, but I think to know the right context of what statistics are and what it is not. And that's where these agent-based models come in, where you can look at a certain point in time and see what's the right thing to do at that moment at a given point in time. and no amount of statistic is going to be that specific to give you that answer often.
Yeah, another way I kind of understand agent-based modeling is as an entrepreneur. So one thing that's always kind of weird is that how can an individual or a group of individuals literally come up with something in their head and create it and manifest it within reality? Now, I do believe, looking at a lot of the different investors out there, there's this great TED Talk talking about what drives the success of a company or the failure of a company. They looked at everything. It was like, they always talk about the jockey, like the team member. They talk about, the idea. They talk about how much capital they were able to raise. A lot of it came down to timing. The number one factor they talked about was timing. So when I look at, especially like physics and science over time, there is this unconscious zeitgeist that people don't even know. And there's this emergence of ideas because we take for granted, let's say, look at special and general theory of relativity. At the time, the framework was kind of set up and foundational that a lot of people actually within a very short time frame came up with similar ideas that Einstein was able to have. Now, obviously, Einstein got the credit one way or another, and he should. But what I've noticed over periods of time when there's a major shift in thinking about how an environment is being created, such as agent-based modeling, it's not very unobvious. So there's people and players that have been thinking about it that are slowly bringing it to the surface, and that it seems like overnight everybody is doing agent-based modeling, or overnight machine learning is the magic thing that everybody's going to jump onto. Whereas in less than if you look at us going to college, machine learning was still a joke. Where for those of you who are familiar with kind of the background. You had people like Marvin Minsky, some of the great artificial intelligence, he actually passed away a few years ago, talking about the perceptron, which is a basic neural model of how you can basically, now how we build neural networks. But there was a paper that came out that said it was a dumb idea, basically, and nobody should ever use this. But it was specifically talking about a single perceptron. But what ended up happening is the excitement, like you're talking about, the creation of people and kids who were going to college who wanted to study artificial intelligence died. And it created a gap, I think, of about a decade or 2 decades where people are like, well, these people are not interested, and they're the ones who are basically creating the science, so why would we even try to pursue it? Now, there was a few people, I can't remember, I think he's a Canadian scientist. He can't sit. He has a problem with his back. But he's, some of you I'm sure could Google it really quickly and figure out who he is. But he was just a person that kept on believing. And he's one of the godfathers of artificial intelligence.
Hinton?
Yep, Hinton. He has a problem with his back and he can't sit down. So he has to we have one of these tables right here where you have to sit up. And it's very interesting. If you get a chance, you just go on Google and watch a couple of his interviews. Pretty amazing. But just... you talk about emergence or creating the future, and you think about it from an entrepreneurship standpoint, there's got to be an ecosystem where it can work. So let me ask you that. What is the ecosystem and the ingredients for agent-based modeling to take off? And maybe you could talk about DeepMind a little bit, and not only AlphaGo, which is, now it feels like forever. It's like 6-7 years ago, I don't know. And then AlphaZero, and how they made it popular to a degree. Now, they didn't necessarily, I think Google bought them for $1 billion. I think the first year they lost $1 billion. I don't know, not exactly know the numbers. But the point is maybe the practicality isn't still there. And I don't believe it's still there yet at a ubiquitous level where everybody's going to use ABM. So what's kind of the ingredients of the environment that needs to be there to make these simulations practical? Yeah. And why are they not practical today?
So I'll say, I think for a lot of things that are not practical with ABM, there are plenty of things that have been done with agent-based modeling. I mean, this is look, if anything, 2020 has taught us with epidemiology and stuff like that. Agent-based models have really helped us figure this out. And yet, you would imagine not everybody may have been aware of it. I think we've probably all seen the curves and what's going to happen if some interventions happen. How can it impact? A lot of these are, some of these are based on more compartment models, but plenty of agent-based models have come in and made it practical. I think the critique, it's not so much a critique. I think where it stands, for it to be truly impactful, fundamentally it has to take in a lot of things which haven't been studied by science in a lot of detail or haven't been quantified yet. One of the classic examples is think about human beings and behavior, right? That is, for it to be practical to humans, you need to in some ways have an understanding of what humans think, what they believe, how will doing something impact what they will think and do down the road and think. And those are extremely hard things, challenging things, which I don't think we have a great model for it yet. So I think what you're seeing, I think you even spoke about this idea of sentient AI and things like that. Right now, these are specific, maybe somewhat generalized AI that's being built.
Yep.
I think where a lot of the research has to go is one, definitely from an environment. We don't even know at this point what kinds of inputs are required from an environment. From here, if we're sitting here, there's light, there's temperature, but I don't know, is there wind speed and a whole host of stuff that goes into our brain that processes it and makes us feel a certain way, right? I think that fundamental science is probably not there. So a lot of sensors, technology, more data has to come in even beyond what we are taking in today, right? So that's from one, science in terms of modeling and stuff like that, or the fundamentals of how to understand humans. Two, environment and just a lot of sensory inputs and how do you think about it. Third is the translation of all that into action, right? And I think that's where we are a little bit more closer today than we were 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's where it's helping us support our actions, whether it's, hey, let's do social distancing so that we can prevent this from spreading, or what's the best way to think about a forest so that we can prevent forest fire? Can we cordon off certain areas which are more likely to kindle and burn, and can you do that ahead of time and things like that? There's a lot of, their drug development now is trying to be a lot more bottom up when you think about genes and the interaction of that with various things. That's going bottom up. So I think we are seeing now with, as you said, the coming of technology and data and cloud computing and all that stuff, it's beginning to happen. There are lots of ways to go, and a lot of these people will need to come together, because I think for biology to work well, you still need to understand human psychology. They need to make sure the tech is working, and that's where the idea of ecosystem comes in, beyond just the environment, right? Our ecosystem has to work. And that's where entrepreneurs and the timing of them becomes so important, because if now one of these things aren't developed, it doesn't work at that particular moment. It's the same thing with perceptron a while back. It was only a dumb idea insofar as nobody could do anything with it at that point.
Yeah.
But the moment technology changed, it changed the game. It goes back to what you said, hey, GameStop may be a blip, but we need to wait for a few things to develop around it. And maybe the model of what happened with GameStop becomes a ubiquitous one where people can actually use that to exploit and create their future, for example.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I always joke, and a lot of people who know me always joke that like one of my middle names is Agent ABM. But every time I talk about it, it's such a subtlety of saying here going forward versus there going backwards, when we were talking about. So again, let's simplify. So I always say physics and statistics are very closely related, and biology and ABM is very closely related. So what is the difference between the two, and why the approaches are completely different, even though it comes to it looks so similar?
Yeah, maybe I'll say this, that I think there are many things in physics that do think about sort of unit level. If you think about how physics has broken things down, it just happens to have started with some very big things, right? So if you think about, and those things worked, if you think about Newton's laws of motion, they did really well until sort of Einstein came up with his relativity and all that stuff. If you think about planetary systems and how that needed to work, I think there were some really good equations which helped us. E = mc squared was another big part of it. So I think the way physics started, I think it was a lot more top-down with bigger things, bigger pictures, bigger objects. And so these things were good enough to explain, because the minute differences probably didn't make that much of a difference.
Yeah, and we'll hold off on quantum computing in a minute.
Yeah.
but keep going.
Yeah, so the minute differences probably didn't make that much of a difference because of how the practicality of it, we probably didn't care. But now, if you think about, well, you're actually trying to send a man to Mars, and how precise it needs to be. Well, they'll need to get down to the fundamentals of like how everything is working, right? So sending a man to Mars is absolutely no trivial, and they need to account for everything. There's top down, there's bottom up, there's everything that needs to be included. So I think physics is going to get there. It's already doing a lot of these things. But biology, fundamentally, how it started out, it was always about a human being, right? I think it started that
or a cell.
Or a cell. But you couldn't explain something in a human being by looking at it. It was very hard to do it.
So you can't look from the outside of a human and figure out the inside,
right? So that's why as doctors were anyway, right, there were different kinds of doctors. There were doctors for the heart, is different from the doctors of the legs and the muscles and the blood and so on and so forth. So by definition, when you cut open, you see these small little things, and it's hard to think about it at an overall level from a biology standpoint. So I think the way they develop, they just happen to be on two ends of the spectrum. And I think as you I'm sure you agree, and a lot of people have said, fundamentally it has to get towards a common point. They just happen to be coming from two different places, given how the entire development in human history happened.
So let's walk through biology. So DNA. Now we have the COVID vaccine using mRNA. And I also really understand that you're going from such a tiny level of information. And actually, yes, there's a lot of information in DNA and mRNA, but it's actually very, very simple building blocks, right? Similar to, I don't want to go too far into fractal theory and chaos theory, but there's a lot of relationship between this. Where Y is, and there's going to be some times where the genetic structure has an abnormality and creates certain types of diseases and stuff like that. Walk us through. So we've all seen that video where you've got the first single cell of an egg, and then it starts to split into all these different cells. So walk us through how ABM could almost simulate this kind of like emergent human through understanding very small fundamental algorithms of like DNA or whatever.
Yeah, and that's something that I think a lot of people are trying. I think there's still ways to go on something like that. But I think when you look at something that small, one of the things that's very hard to do is make it supremely complex. Because when you start saying, hey, it's one cell, single cell organism, and stuff like that, then I think in some ways it's very hard to say it's capable of exhibiting extremely complex behavior in and of itself.
Yeah.
I think what you are almost forced to do, it's a good thing, is to say, hey, what are some fundamental things about that? What is it trying to achieve? And is there a way to simulate that? I think that's where what people have tried to say is, hey, when you think about a cell, what is it looking to do? Survival, food, growth, reproduction, and stuff like these things, right? And if you start looking at that and add to it a little bit of DNA, which in some ways is a guiding element of how things should proceed towards its ultimate goal, right? In terms of what the body will look like, how the mind will look like, how will this all sync together. Some fairly simple things can start creating some complex organisms, right? Now, a classic example of this was, I think this was The Game of Life, was One Newman or something like that, where, hey, small things could create some massive things which were self-sustaining. So just that gives you an idea of how simple rules can create something complicated which is self-sustaining, right? And this is something that people can go look online, and it is amazing the amount of complex sort of behavior that can come out of it. And to me, when I think about biology, going back to your question, I think simulation for the sake of it, for sure, great. But I think where ABM for me really helps is what are the environments, what are the rules maybe, right, that are required for this to happen? And that gives us all a fundamental understanding of how biology may work, right? To give you one another way, a simple example, going to neural networks, right? We all knew there were cells, neurons, and there were synapses. And if you think about it, that itself has been the foundation of deep learning. As crazy as it is, all it is a cell with synapses to other cells. And that helped us understand so many things. And that's why I think going down to the biology and understanding, hey, simple rules, what does it need for it to multiply?
Yeah.
Right? You can try out a bunch of things, be wrong in some simulations, be correct in some others, and seeing if it ultimately builds towards that. That's where the foundational truths come in, right? I think that's where you start simulating a lot of these things and taking it from there.
So, machine learning, it's been the buzzword
forever.
Well, it feels like it's forever. It hasn't even been that long, relatively speaking, at least from the computational age. So, we use machine learning in our models. Yeah. We build models. A lot of people in the audience have been using and building machine learning models. And then for the rest of us, we've heard about it too much. We think we get it. We saw a whole bunch of YouTube videos and we figured it all out. But there's this computational problem of machine learning models. So walk us, what is machine learning model? And what has been the evolution of ABM combining it with machine learning models versus traditional straightforward algorithms back in the 90s and 2000s.
Yeah. So machine learning, I think, just take a step back for everybody here, right? It's a part of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is the idea of how do you get sort of, thinking outside of human beings, right? To sort of simulate, help us out, do a bunch of things, so on. Machine learning is specific to machines, right? How do you actually get machines to be intelligent and so on and so forth? And that's where a lot of, focus has been over the last few years. Deep learning is a part of machine learning, right? And how that happens. Now, there are many approaches to machine learning. Fundamentally, it's about how do you take something outside of me to be intelligent and help me out to do whatever. It's as simple a task as maybe do my laundry, or it can be as complicated as send somebody to Moon and Mars and things like that, right? So that's what machine learning is. Now, when I think about agent-based modeling and machine learning, for me, agent-based modeling in some ways is very simple. It's about bottom-up, right? Now, historically, what's happened is, if you think about the agent itself, we've actually not given agent a lot of credit. We've put rules around it.
Rules.
We've put sort of environment which are complicated. We tell how it may interact. We don't say much about the agent. It could be a dumb book or a pen or whatever it is. It's all going to do the same thing. And to me, where the next evolution of this is, can we put some intelligence inside that agent?
Yeah.
And this is where machine learning comes in. And here is where it's ironic in some ways. If I think about a lot of machine learning model, a lot of people would argue it's statistical. So in some ways, statistics is going within an agent. And that's going to happen. That's always going to be the thing, where you're going to go into smaller and smaller pieces where a lot more things can be developed in an agent-based fashion. And until then, we have these machine learning models, these statistical models to help us out in the meanwhile, right? So I think of this as getting agents to be a lot more intelligent. Now, where does it matter, for example? So I was reading this, I think it was a YouTube video. This happened, I want to say a couple of months ago, where they were trying to solve the problem of congestion in Texas, I believe, or something like that. They said, hey, there's a highway, there are 3 lanes or something like that. It's very congested. What do we do? Top down, let's add just more lanes. It just makes a lot of sense, right? More cars, more lanes. Do that. They did that. It actually got worse. And they were like, how does that work? And what they didn't realize in some ways is like, hey, there's this idea of induced demand. We forget that there's a feedback. To whatever you do, there's a feedback. And when you don't think like that, that's when you think about a human being or an agent, there's this idea of a feedback. What happened was, when you expand lanes, people who were actually taking trains now want to drive, and you overcorrect for it, it got worse. In fact, the last I saw in Boston, they took away a highway and improved the traffic in that thing, because a lot more people, it just got so complicated that people started taking the trains from that standpoint. So again, the idea is, we never usually think of feedback because it's really hard to think about it. We can always say, hey, when this happens, I do that. But what's the impact of that back? How will the other agents respond and do that, right? And machine learning is starting to do that. If you think about AlphaGo and a lot of these things, which fundamentally are saying, I can actually think through what my opponent's going to do and figure that out, can preempt it. And I can do this better than a human for that particular thing. And that's where that intelligence goes. To me, it goes inside an agent, and that becomes a lot more interesting and exciting.
So there's a computational problem.
Yeah.
So it's hard enough to run a machine learning model with huge amount of data. Everybody says big data. I'm not going to use big data. But any even remotely large amount of data, it takes a while for these models to be trained, these neural network models. So you've got an agent, say I'm an agent, and you've built some level of deep learning model about who I am based upon all the data you possibly get: financial data, social media data, geolocation data. Pretty much your phone has so much of this information, health tracking data, all this data. And I want to predict my behavior. The problem that we know is that, well, what about the interaction between agents, right? So it's one thing to build my model. That alone is difficult. But then I've got to simulate the behavior of us interacting, let alone 7 billion people interacting across all these geographic infrastructure and all the different environmental conditions. And it becomes, basically, it feels like it's impossible. And is there any way for us to solve this problem? So can you walk us through that problem and why it's causing, I think there needs to be a lot of more computational power to start running large-scale simulations, and what are the problems around that?
Yeah, and this, I remember back in the day when other things were impossible. Suddenly they became possible, right? So to me, I think this is always going to happen.
No,
right?
I feel it's a matter of years away. It's not centuries or decades
That's
away.
Right. So there are a few things, right? I think this is still, the way I think about this is still a journey that we're all taking, right? This is not going to end in 2 years where this will all be solved. And the way to think about it, and we have to work within the constraints in some ways we all have, it's the environmental constraints. Well, maybe CPUs and GPUs and TPUs can only run so fast, so much faster, right? And maybe when you want to get into quantum computing, when that happens, maybe this will all change. But until then, that's a constraint of the environment. And we still have important problems to solve, right? We still have pandemics to prevent. We still have human suffering to take care of and all that good stuff. And so the way and that's why I say, right, I don't think statistical models and ABMs are trying to do very separate things. I think it's about finding the right balance of these things and pushing this boundary of where one stops and the other starts as far as possible within the constraints of what we have. And you won't solve every problem, but there are plenty of problems we'll solve. And so let's take an example, right? So with pandemic, right? It's impossible to predict everything across the globe. I mean, there are many scenarios that are developed, right? And that's how we've done it as human beings, that Asian-based approaches have helped develop many scenarios. And then we say, okay, but I know the limitations of it. I haven't been able to find out the data to model this particular interaction. And so I'm going to put some artificial constraints around it. This is where things like policies comes in. This is where things like culture comes in, and a whole host of stuff, right? And until then, I think it's going to be a combination of top-down policies, culture, and bottom-up how best we can predict and prevent and things like that. And that's going to get better over time. And until then, that's a boundary we just have to play with. And computation is a huge part of it. It's part of that.
So, human behavior and ABM. There's this, you've got this, we start with this simple DNA or whatever, and we create this semi-infinitely complex being. And then you take on top of that the interactions between other people. When we've got, there's so much social concern, there has been a lot of civil unrest, there's been a lot of countries that are doing massive central bank printing. That affects people who have savings accounts that are being decimated through hyperinflation in certain markets. There just seems like it's impossible to ever model any of this because there's just too many things to take into consideration. At the same time, you're saying that there's some base level fundamentals that can be modeled that can then create kind of an emergent approach to what could happen.
Yeah.
And then you can actually create that as a reality. So walk us through ABM and its future in relation to modeling human behavior. And where does that rest? Is there any value? Obviously, I believe there's a lot of value, but what's going to be the opportunities that can be taken advantage of using this technology for modeling human behavior?
Yeah, so a few things before getting into it, because human behavior is incredibly complex, changes all the time, and there's a whole host of stuff we probably don't know about, right? But the way to make sense of all this is the word prediction. I think one of the things that I've moved away from fundamentally is this idea of one perfect prediction. I don't know how, it's never been that useful because it's just one, it's too hard. And I think the better way to think about this is, hey, I think we get comfortable with a range of possibilities, right? Hey, this can happen, that can happen, and we are prepared for those eventualities, right? As opposed to whether it's exactly 10.2% versus 100 point whatever, that's less of the point. I think it's more of that. And a lot of the work we do, a lot of the things we do, they are never that precise anyway. And so I think it's fundamentally empowering to think about different possibilities and preparing for those. Like, hey, what can I do to actually make this happen? And driving things like that. Now, from a risk perspective, that's a really good way to think about it. Now, if you think about our hedge fund days and risk and stuff like that, it's a curve. We try and say, hey, there's a probability of everything. But you don't plan like that, right? You plan of, let's say, hey, if this scenario happens, I think I know what to do. If this scenario happens, I think I know what to do, and so on and so forth. And that's where Taleb and a lot of these folks have gone, right? Which is like, hey, it's very hard to model this as a curve, but sometimes you think of these massive discrete events, and have you created your life, your company, your organization in such a way that you can actually address that if it were to happen. And that's a lot more empowering way of thinking about it. So going back to human behavior, I think that's the first paradigm. I don't know if we'll ever be able to model perfect human behavior, but I think what we can get at pretty reasonably is, hey, this may happen, that may happen from a human behavior or something may happen. So for example, if something terrible were to happen, there may be a scenario of mass migration that may happen.
Yeah.
Or there may be a lot of deaths or something like that. Or maybe there is this massive innovation that solves everything, right? And then you say, okay, again, how am I positioned best to adapt to all those scenarios? And that's sort of how I think about it. But fundamentally, a human, unfortunately or fortunately, I think that's where the science has been very, very wonky, because the math behind it isn't perfect. That fundamental math of how do you think about humans has to evolve. And it hasn't been the case because, again, a lot of our focus has been top-down sort of statistics where you can make the entire sort of variability of humans go away. Because on an average, yes, human beings behave in a certain way. Stock markets always say that, right? People will keep making the same mistakes every 20 years as you go along. True, but I think we need to get down to a lot more of a fundamental understanding of how humans work.
So one of the areas that scientists don't like to venture into is things like consciousness or values and principles and how they drive certain behavior. I think it's exciting, though, because if what we're saying is that if you're looking for a certain outcome and you're being driven by certain principles and values, and it could create a certain outcome, that becomes very powerful because you can then see how certain businesses or technologies or things that you want to prevent or things you want to create, you can take base level ideas to then drive how the behavior is going to be to see what possibilities could be created in the future. And what's also interesting is that if you take it as a snapshot from point to point, so say for instance, we'll do a Miss American pageant. I want to solve all of poverty. So if I'm going to go about solving all poverty, and I've got these principles and values. I want to end world hunger. Bill Gates just came out with a book on climate change and how to make that impact. And I've got all these different values that, whether it's today's zeitgeist embraces or something that I, from my past, have said, hey, these are things that are important to me. How would you then take that approach of principles and values to drive certain outcomes and use agent-based modeling? Because I think that, at least from a personal standpoint, that's where it becomes real.
Yeah.
Where it's like, hey, this isn't just another model of what's going on or what has gone on. This can be used as a tool to actually drive decisions and create futures and also understand the ramifications of them as well. So how would you approach building a model based upon principles and values to drive certain outcomes, like, say, ending poverty or something like that, or starvation or hunger or whatever?
So there are a couple of things. One, I mean, even if I reflect back on the books we've read, right, if you look at Tony Robbins and stuff like that, I think there's a lot of foundational understanding, or at least hypothesis, in terms of how values and behaviors and all these things that people have can create these long-term outcomes for them, right? There is a fundamental thing. If you think about civilizations, they've been founded on things like value. Now, it's complicated when you have to say, hey, value, what's going to happen on day 1 versus day 2 versus day 3, but over time, we know values and systems like that have created some massive, massive things in this world, including civilizations, companies, countries, and so on and so forth, right? And oftentimes the conflicts that we see are sort of the difference in values and things like that, right? So to me, there at a broad level, there are already some foundational things available to start thinking about values and the impact of it. And I think a lot of scientists are starting to now look into that because, one, I think with science, it needs to be measurable. And how do you measure values? It starts with something as fundamental as that. How do you quantify the thing, right? Because I think I agree with a lot of what people said. Hey, if you can't quantify it, how do you know it's real? You don't know if it's, if you can't quantify it, it doesn't even exist. I would disagree. And I think we need to get comfortable with the idea there may be some things we can't quantify, but we'll still need to think about it. Because they are important, like values and things like that. And as parents, we know that inherently, right? You and I probably can't quantify what kind of value and what does it mean, but we know when it exists and when it doesn't exist, right? So there's something to it. And let me circle back to that point. I want to say something else, and then I'll come back to sort of the eventual question you asked me. The idea of creating a future once you have an agent-based model, there's a parallel I want to give, which I think is instructive. Like this was a time, early 1990s, and the promise of internet was, hey, the information will be available to every single person at that instant, which means the volatility in the market will go away because everybody knows it, and everybody will converge towards a certain way of thinking because facts are going to rule the world and stuff like that. It doesn't. And that's one of the things we may need to be open to, where when we actually solve this idea of information and prediction and things like that, let's not forget there are humans with different motives. Everybody is self-serving. And so when we all have this amazing technology, I may use it for a different purpose than you, and you may not be able to predict that because everybody's average technology quotient has gone up, right? So I think some of the fundamental problems will probably still continue to exist just because humans are self-serving, and we may want to solve poverty, but we may have different values and we'll do it in different ways.
Yeah.
And God forbid it clashes. At that point, nobody's going to, one of us is not going to create a future, or both of us will fail at that point. So in some ways, yes, it can be used as a model to do it, but I think at any point we have to realize technology is for everybody. Everybody's technology quotient goes up, and they all have individual interests in how they'll want to use technology, and that will drive the ultimate sort of
So
outcome.
that's also a factor. Is it self-serving from an individual or potentially a group?
Sure.
Because that's the great thing with ABM is that it's the interaction between agents within the environment, not necessarily the individual within the environment. Now, you can do that, but it doesn't make as much sense. And that's where I think how the zeitgeist of, say, the United States is very interesting, where if you look at, I don't watch the news. I read the newspaper. I talk about this, I don't know how many years I've been doing it now. But what I understand is you have a large percentage of the U.S. population that's watching, say, Fox News versus MSNBC or whatever channel. And so you create a collective consciousness around certain principles and values. And this topic of echo chamber has come up several times, where you have a belief, you have an idea, you have a value or principles, and so you like all these things on all these different social media platforms, and it feeds yourself what you already want. Now, on one side, from a marketing standpoint, that's fantastic, because then you can get to the customer who wants your product or service more effectively, and then identify from a segmentation standpoint who I should be creating what marketing channels to sell what products to. On the flip side, it also creates this massive negative effect because you're not able to introduce new information and ideas to the system. And so it becomes more and more insular. Now, this isn't new. Everybody always feels like this is the first time any of this stuff has ever happened, but it's been happening forever. So walk us through, how can you simulate the behavior if there's like an echo chamber? And then also, how do you add in chaos into that environment or new ideas that may conflict with the perspective, principles, and values you have, so you can have more of an open-minded dialogue and conversation about very controversial topics. Now, I don't even start into that. I'm pretty PC about most things, but it is very disconcerting, generally speaking, because it's one thing in the United States, it's a whole different ballgame in certain other countries. Where when we said echo chamber, you're not allowed to have other thoughts, and so the elimination of thoughts and ideas becomes kind of a thesis for certain countries and policies and dictatorships and organizations. Where is the balance? What can ABM do to create that creativity within a system that seems very insular?
Yeah, I think there are a few themes in what you said I want to touch upon. One is this idea of hierarchy within agents, and the way, and a lot of what we think about today, I think in biology, I think the idea of hierarchy is a lot more apparent, but not always, right? Which is, they're agents, but there could be a hierarchy of them, which is just all encompassing and a lot more powerful. Echo chamber being one of them, for example, right? I think one of the things about agent-based modeling, and this is where a lot of the research is going and will continue to go, is it just the individual or a group of people can be called an individual, or what constitutes that agent fundamentally can be influenced? The distinction between the environment and the agent can start going away. And that's one of the risks. And you actually learn that by actually doing some of these things. And that's the benefit of this, right? So we knew this, that echo chambers can be created very, very back in the day. I think this is not anything new. people move towards what they prefer is not anything new. I think psychologists have always said that. It's something we hadn't considered. Like when we developed the model top down, I think we never sort of thought about it in a bottom way. What's actually going to happen at the individual level? With all these choices, how will it happen? Right? And we leave it to chance. We leave it to whoever's sort of trying to do something to see what happens. And even then, they haven't quite figured it out. They try experiments and it happens a certain way. So with agent-based modeling, I think one of the things that helps, again, it's not prediction for me, it's about creating the various possibilities. If we understand this possibility, what is it that we can do something about? That's one thing, right? So that's the idea of individual versus the hierarchy and what's more relevant, and maybe even the vanishing of the distinction between environment and individual itself, right? Where the environment becomes the individual in some way, for example. So that's one piece of it, right? And so when I think about what does it mean for us fundamentally and how agent-based modeling can help in, it's trying to bring in this psychological elements, right? As we go about simulating various models and behaviors and things like that, so that we have a much broader understanding of how this all starts working. For the longest time, I think when we think of individuals, we think of different, individuals are different than big companies and corporations and stuff like that. And although it's a collection of that, but the group, the way that thinks, it's very different. And that's why mob mentality, mob behavior is very different than individuals, right? And if you think about a lot of recent events, and we have to think of it that way with what's happened, mob and the collection is very different than that. And I think that's where a lot of the future understanding of agent-based modeling will go, where it's power to the individual, and that may not align with individuals who have more of a group mandate, where you think governments, think companies and stuff like that. And it'll almost always be at conflict in many places, and that's where who understand this nature better will get ahead. I think, and right now, I think this power of technology is concentrated in more of the people who can afford it, as opposed to people who are fundamentally at the ground level who can use it. And that's the disadvantage of technology in some ways. By the time it comes down to the human being, it's gone up so much more that we are catching up. And I think one part of what we've spoken about is how do we actually get to the masses, get to the bottom. I think that's where the benefit of technology comes in. And we have to use that to actually create these models and stuff like that. So there is education involved in terms of the benefits of these things, and if we don't do it, where this can go. There is, the how do individuals work with organizations? That becomes a huge thing. Right now, just think about it with the pandemic, the entire culture of how individuals are working with companies, that's changed fundamentally, and companies have had to adapt to it on such massive scale. Imagine 2 years ago if a group of people said, we want to work from home. That wouldn't work. And now companies suddenly realize, wow, that experiment went pretty well, right? So let's do that. So I think it unfortunately needed a massive spike as a pandemic to do that, but we could have learned from a lot of these things. I think we know what happens when a pandemic happens. We knew things would have to be shut down. If we could have simulated that over time, done this for more of a year, 2 years, and if you look at Bill Gates' TED Talks and stuff like that, he's actually said these things could have happened. What's the value in doing this? Who's incentivized to do this? Who's incentivized to look at it? I think that's where, to me, an independent think tank or organization or group has to come in, who's fundamentally looking to try to get at these fundamental truths of nature, as opposed to just something commercial.
So, kind of wrapping it up, I know you and I constantly read and watch videos and just constantly thinking about these ideas. And a lot of people who are either watching or listening want to get more meat. And we I think at the Institute, the problem with some of this technology, just generally speaking, is it goes from 0 to 100 miles an hour in one book, where it gets so complicated so quickly that there really isn't curriculum. And hopefully you and I are going to help create with some other people curriculum around how to go from a base level, I don't know anything about ABM or machine learning, or we're not going to throw in some calculus in there and linear algebra to start. But are there any books or ways that we can get started? And I've got a few ideas as well, but are there things that you've read that might be interesting for people to think about to get started with it, or even foundational ideas around it?
So I guess there are many ways of sort of coming at it. I think when I've spoken to people, some have looked at it more from a technology standpoint, computation standpoint. So I think there's plenty of stuff from that perspective, right? Truly trying to understand computational power, looking to sort of simulate how agents interact with massive computational powers. There's a lot of, on NetLogo, you can simulate a bunch of things, but try and sort of build that in Python and simple experiments. Yeah. That's available for the people who are computer science.
NetLogo is, I would say, is a great tool to just play with the most absolute basic agent, and how does it create very simple algorithms out there and how they interact with each other. So that's a really great starting software to kind of like, if you don't have any clue, because they actually have a lot of preset simulations in NetLogo that you can just get up and running. Like, I think there's like a forest fire one. There's like the rabbit,
how it does,
there's a rabbit or deer and wolf population and their relationship. So I think that's a great one. What was the other one that you were talking about? In Python, are there any libraries or any books or anything?
There are plenty of libraries in Python or whatever people want to use, I think. But in some ways, I think let's just realize, right, if you want to do this, it's not that complicated to get started, right? You're looking at individual pieces and put in some rules and see how this evolves, right? Take examples from your own life, right? Let's try and simulate the traffic that happens, right? Put a pattern where, hey, here are 4 roads, and as these different sort of vehicles come in, what are the interactions? What kind of rules that you need to implement to do this, right? So for the people who are still, again, you need to be a little bit more technologically or technically oriented from a coding standpoint. Python, R, and there are even some, I think, online sort of self-serve tools you can make things happen. Beyond that, I think one thing I like to look at is, some of these really good publications which talk about human psychology and interactions in nature. They get down to the human being. Yeah. They are specifically, I think, some of these Nature articles. I was reading one actually today on how they think about the impact of pollutants in the environment and how does that have an impact that has on human health. And that's done from an agent-based perspective, because they look at where people are, where they travel, what's the impact of that, where do they live, et cetera, and that's a lot better predictor of impact of pollutants on human health than anything else that we've seen. So keep your ears and eyes open. And the last thing I'll say is, we are living this, right? I think if you think about I or you as an individual, like what we say, what we do, just be self-aware, right? And these are the little things that you actually will take sort of to create those models, right? And I think a lot of it is just awareness. I think the beauty about this is we are living it. We are the agent. We may not be the neural network, but we are the agent. And so if we sort of think from that perspective, hopefully things become a lot more clear.
One book that I really like, if you guys like finance and economics, is called The Origin of Wealth by Beinhocker. I think it's a great book. Simple, easy to read book. In fact, I didn't even know it was a book. I think it was when Borders bookstore was going bankrupt. I just bought everything in the finance section and artificial intelligence section. So it's an older book, but it's super simple and easy to kind of understand, this is the interaction between individuals and how you can model behavior at a large-scale economic interaction and stuff like that. So this is, our first podcast. Hopefully everybody didn't go to sleep too much. So I think that the difference in approach, yes, I guess those of you who are live streaming are seeing it more like a webinar. I think what doesn't exist and what we're trying to create is not only the ecosystem, but be some of the content creators. So, help have a dialogue around it across different industries. Consume it in any format that you guys want to consume it at. We want to build curriculum. We want to write books. We want to publish papers. We're going to need a lot of help with that. So, just because we're excited about it doesn't mean that you can't actually help us with that. You can check out the website. It's librium.com, and you should check us out. Get more information. Subscribe to the podcast. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. We'll have a lot more people coming and talking. But also, most importantly, if you're interested in a lot of the science and technology, reach out to Jody Cullity, who's our executive director. She'll connect you with other people, researchers around the world, and other projects that are going on around the world. And it's really, really exciting. I think everything, when you're in it, everything seems like it's around you. But I'm realistic. We've been in this space for now decades. It's crazy. It's already 2021. And it's still in its nascent age, which means that for those of you who are, in college and you're trying to figure out, what do I want to do next? What's the upcoming technologies? I've been lecturing at Georgia Tech for 16 years and at Georgia State for almost a decade. I talk to almost every single one of my classes each year that I teach that this is what is becoming more and more ubiquitous as far as the technology is going to be going. So I'm telling you right now, if you're not understanding what we're talking about, you need to start getting involved in the space, because it is how things are moving towards. We know it in our own businesses. We're applying it, and it actually makes a pragmatic difference in what is actually being done in the business and entrepreneurial environment as well. So thanks so much for your time. I know you guys have been really patient, but hopefully it was enjoyable. Thanks, Sandeep.
Thank you.